Okay, good afternoon. My name is Robert Tippmann, Vice Chairman of the German Emissions Trading Association and Association for Climate Protection. I'm your host and moderator today. This event is co-organized by us, BVEK, then ETH Zurich, and the government of Morocco. We called the event Market Mechanisms, Whereto from Kyoto to Paris. As we all know, there's currently not yet a lot of substantial in the negotiations. We lack a bit of progress on Article 6 approaches, rules and regulations. And some even think, well, it may be a bit of similar time frame for getting the rule book and the regulations sorted out compared to when we look at how long it took from the Kyoto Agreement to have the rule book ready in 5 years. So also, of course, all the constituencies, experts, business organizations, research, we are asked to contribute, make proposals and observations, and that's also what we try to do here today. There are questions like how much will remain from the, let's say, past regime related to eligibility requirements, technical infrastructures from the mechanisms, methodologies and things like that, and what needs or should be completely renewed or made completely different. Do we have the same discussions all over again and go through the same debates on additionality, eligibility and things like that if we think about market mechanisms, discussions we had in the past on the CDM or emissions trading? Also questions like what does it mean in the context of the NDCs and the Paris Agreement? These questions, additionality, is it still an issue? Where does it fit in? And also thinking about how do we include sectors that haven't contributed that much better into the scheme, and also incentivize private sector contributions in investments. How much oversight is needed under Article 6? How much NRV, accountability and comparability? And it's for sure that debates about carbon markets, market mechanism, carbon markets involving emissions trading and other market mechanisms and carbon pricing will continue to play a role. And that's why we thought it's important to have this event today. How will we proceed? We have 3 keynote presentations that will be followed by comments and views from panelists, who I will introduce a bit later. So we'll want to right away dive into the keynote presentations, and we'll start with Bjarne Steffen from the ETH Zurich on an innovative CDM-type Paris mechanism for effective mitigation, which will be followed by a presentation from the government of Morocco by Mohamed Nbou. And last but not least, we are still waiting for the final speaker from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development on sectoral mechanisms. Hope that he'll make it in the meantime. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Bjarne. You have the floor and for the first presentation.
Thank you, Robert. Good afternoon from my side. I'm with ETH Zurich, which is a research university in Switzerland. And we do research on the interaction between climate or energy policy and technological change. And this is also the perspective that we took to have a look at the Article 6 in the Paris Agreement and which opportunities that might give for, as we called it, an innovative CDM-type Paris mechanism that focuses on de-risking. I'd like to start by motivating why de-risking is worth having a look at in the context of Article 6 mechanisms, then describe functioning of a mechanism on a high level, how you could imagine that work, present some, let's say, high-level simulation results for an exemplary project, and then definitely use the opportunity to discuss with the panelists, but also with you in the audience, pros and cons of this aspect. Obviously, The Paris mechanism, we called it CDM type, but it will be different from the clean development mechanism from the CDM. I think during the last couple of days, by following discussions on Article 6, it became very clear that many parties call for a clean start with the Paris Agreement, also given the somehow mixed experience with the CDM. But also, obviously, the context changed since the Kyoto and CDM world. It's clear that compared to the Kyoto Protocol, where only Annex 1 countries had commitments, we have a very different approach under the Paris Agreement, where in principle all countries have commitments as per their NDCs. And also, especially in the area of renewable energy, we see a very different abatement cost situation during these days. So looking back at the CDM world, we call it 2005 plus, it was a time where many renewables in many contexts had a very high abatement cost and needed substantial subsidies to make projects viable for private investors. And since then, we saw a strong decline of investment cost for many renewables, particularly solar PV and wind. They also have a long track record now in utility scale sizes that allows a whole bunch of investors to, in principle, consider investments. However, and that's the but that you always have, these renewable energy technologies, they are still very capital extensive, and they will stay it by their characteristics, and investment risks and accordingly financing costs play a big role. Especially in many developing countries where financing costs are high, and that strongly affects the profitability of potential renewable projects, even though capital expenditure has been reduced. And finally, there's mixed experience with CDM. I won't talk much about it. That has been discussed a lot in other events, I noticed. But we definitely can draw on an ecosystem that has been created under the CDM, which is still around. We have to address additionality concerns that have been around with the CDM. And we hopefully draw some learnings from that for the Article 6 mechanism. I'd like to illustrate the second point because that's, I feel, less discussed in the context of Article 6 mechanisms. On the left-hand side, you see the solar PV learning curve, which probably most people are aware of, but I feel it's a bit less present in discussion about market mechanism, even though that's a tremendous change in context, with capital cost declining dramatically. What didn't change that much, and that's on the right-hand side, is the structure of cost you have in projects, however. This is a split of levelized cost of electricity of different technology. And you see for solar PV and wind onshore, the two big renewable energy technologies, the lion's share of cost, it's capital expenditure, and it's the financing cost that you need to finance these front-loaded investments. And if you have such a high share of cost that's needed for initial investment, it's obviously that the financing cost plays a major role. That's this yellow and orange boxes there. And so for solar PV and wind onshore, it's particularly important how big your investment risks is and how expensive your debt and equity is. This is a typical developing country figures, some 10% debt and 18% equity return. And you see it's above 90%, that's in this bucket. So this is a starting point why we think it's worth putting some attention on how an Article 6 mechanism could address particularly the risk side of the equation. So we propose to think about a mechanism that focuses on de-risking, given the fact that renewables, if properly de-risked, will soon be profitable in many contexts without further subsidies beyond the de-risking. And we propose to start in this thinking, that's also what I will present, in a particular sector, in the sector of renewable energy. And we'll discuss some features how this could work, how also you could think about this mechanism to add to national NDC commitments and thereby have some additionality in renewables that then can be translated in corresponding adjustments of NDC under the Article 6 accounting. By bearing in mind that even though this is particularly on renewable energy and a specific sector, this could be extended to other sectors at a later stage. So to come to the functioning, we start with the idea, and that's not too different from a CDM, that we have one region or one country which has broken down emission reduction requirements to certain units. You see the power plants here on the left in Europe. And we have another country which has the potential for renewable energy project with a low abatement cost. And then one could imagine that these countries get into some relationship, either bilaterally or on a multilateral basis, join an established centralized unit. Here it's called the International Carbon Asset Unit, by agreeing on having a certain, based on a certain level of stringency and compatibility on the NDC, having a unit that allows for transfers under Article 6, and also specifying how corresponding adjustment of the NDCs will work. And this unit would give the opportunity for the buying side to, let's say, buy a certified emission reduction in euros or dollars per ton CO2, which is then transformed, so to say, by this International Carbon Asset Unit through de-risking mechanisms into renewable energy projects that are enabled through these de-risking mechanisms. And then if there's a mitigation outcome that's additional to the initial NDC of this is just exemplary India and South Africa, there's a certified emission reduction issued to the buying private sector party. To zoom into the right-hand side, into the selling side, one could imagine we have a country which has an NDC with a well-specified emission reduction path and already some renewable energy extension plans, that's the bottom side here, and then holds auction and has PPAs for renewable energy projects that should be realized in according to this national NDC. Everything that goes beyond, so everything potential renewable energy project beyond this path, that's the top side, would have to rely on market prices and be merchant either on a wholesale market or find some corporate procurement PPA. And then probably is not viable as an investment, otherwise one wouldn't need these PPAs. And this is where the International Carbon Asset Unit then steps in by adding to these earnings from market prices of merchant power plants with de-risking instruments, for instance, option or bands, swaps for power prices, I will come to that in a minute, or some instruments for foreign exchange rate, and by that enable additional renewable energy projects. From the project point of view, very briefly, this is not surprising to some, I assume. It's basically looks like result-based finance. This shows in the colors the difference to the CDM of the proposal. So I will focus on what's different. We wouldn't have generally involuntary carbon markets, that's the top line, as a source of the payment, but it would be this international unit, which then selects the recipients based on auctions or some criteria and remunerates projects in selling countries per, let's say, green electricity generated megawatt hours. The payment, and that's important, is determined not based on a global emissions market, like in the CDM, where then again, either on the level of the project or on the level of some project developer, you would have a lot of uncertainty and risk on the CDM price, in addition to the risks you already have, but based on local markets for the energy sold that is complemented and de-risked by these instruments. To illustrate how this could work, and I won't go into much detail on that, we did some simulations for a hypothetical 5 megawatt solar PV plant in India. So this is a grid-connected project. And we model that the project's revenue, so the cash flows that come in, and the operational and financing cost, and then the expected net cash flow that comes out of it and is paid to equity investors that is counted using their rate of return. And by the net present value or NPV rule, you can assess a project as viable if it has a positive net present value and not viable otherwise. And that's not trivial because you have a lot of risk if you do not have a PPA. So what this assumes is on the top we have a merchant power price in India. There's a wholesale market since about 2010. You see the past development, and we modeled the future potential future price development with some financial and mathematical model, Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process. And we also modeled uncertainty on the second revenue source you have in principle in India, which is some renewable energy certificate. It's in the law. It's not really stringently implemented yet, and there the question is whether when will it be implemented, if at all, so that you actually get earnings. And this is the bottom part, so it's more yes/no question. And then the result is that projects are not viable based on this only. But, and that's the instrument we are proposing, you can try to de-risk that financially. So what we tried here, it's an option that basically pays the difference between the electricity market price or the renewable energy certificate market price and a certain strike price. And if the price falls below this level, you get a payment from this option, from the Article 6 mechanism unit. And if it's above, you don't, because then you already have enough of an electricity price. And the strike price is set according to a level such that projects would always have a positive net present value. As you can see, I won't go into too much detail on the right-hand side, that there's some specification of this instrument where you can realize these projects with much lower cost as compared to just having a revenue transfer in a PPA. Correspondingly, we modeled some foreign exchange rate risk instruments. These could be particularly interesting as many developing and recently industrialized countries have high cost of capital on the local markets, and they could be much cheaper if you could draw on international capital markets and borrow in US dollar or in euros. And that's what we illustrate on the right-hand side, that if you only achieve a reduction in your risk margin, in your cost of equity and cost of debt by 2%, you already reduce cost of de-risking instruments a lot. So to sum up some of the characteristics and advantages of a de-risking mechanism in the context of Article 6, we believe it can offer, in many cases, low abatement cost and much lower abatement cost than focusing on revenue transfers. And by that, it might increase the incentive for buyer of this instrument, so for the industrialized countries to raise their ambition. Because by drawing on this mechanism, and that's like the general motivation for Article 6 trading, you get a cheaper abatement and you can raise your ambition. This could also have an incentive for the buyer side, for the seller side, so for the developing country that sells these emission reduction under certain conditions, because this mechanism will definitely require a certain stringency and compatibility of NDCs. So whoever buys the certificate, they will only agree to it if the NDCs in the first step allow for corresponding adjustments, and the second step allow for that in environmental integer matter. So it might be an incentive then also to have a stringent and ambitious NDC to participate in this trading at all. And finally, for the pros, so to say, this certainly only addresses one sector and would be applicable in probably not all countries, but only some. But this also means that as a pilot, it could probably be started relatively soon to gain some experience and have some lessons learned from that then again that you could draw on for broader Article 6 rollout. On the challenge side, there's definitely much room for further clarifications and discussions around that. I'm looking forward to your feedback and comments later on. What exactly are the minimum requirements that NDCs need for such a mechanism? What's the process for corresponding adjustments? Who should be this international unit? Is that rather a bilateral thing? Is that a multilateral thing with some multilateral institutions? Many open questions. And finally, how could this interact with other sectoral mechanisms? I think we hear about that, some of such other sectoral mechanisms in a minute, and with generally other approaches and instruments in a broader picture. And with that, thanks for your attention. Back to you.
Thanks, Bjarne, for this fresh view on market mechanisms, indeed trying to see what can be slightly done different. Also, we are happy to have the last speaker here as well from the World Business Council, Philippe Fonta. But the second presentation now, as we had to restructure the agenda a little bit, will be from the government of Morocco, Mohamed Nbou, with his views on the role of market mechanisms in Morocco's NDC implementation strategy. Mohamed, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's a pleasure to speak to you about this very important topic on how market mechanism can enable NDC implementation, and in particular to share some experiences of Morocco. I will start by sharing insight Morocco's success in the Kyoto Protocol, clean development mechanism. Then I will move toward the Paris Agreement and the approach that Morocco have to implement its NDC. And I will share some information on Morocco's role in pioneer Paris mechanism. And I will close with sharing our view on how market mechanism could play an important role in implementation of NDC. Under the framework of the Kyoto Protocol, Morocco has been active since 2000 and appointed the first designated national authorities of all African countries. And Morocco also promising a project earlier on various activities. Project include the first large-scale renewable program under the CDM. And since 16 further projects has been registered in the area of renewable energy, heat recovery, and fuel switch. Here you can see the list of all registered CDM projects of Morocco, showing the wide range of technology and project size. I am not going to go inside each project. Moving on the Paris Agreement, Morocco presented its NDC with a significant improvement from its INDCs. This was recognized as a very proactive approach to NDC formulation by the Climate Action Tracker. Also, it was in particular recognized as the only NDC which is compatible with ambitious of 1.5 degrees target. Morocco also put forward an unconditional contribution, which is 17% below the business as usual case, corresponding to investment of 26 billion US dollars to fulfill the more ambitious commitment of Morocco made in the NDC. Morocco relies partly on financial contribution. The need for international support from 2020 to 2030 are 24 billion US dollars. To mobilize the necessary international support, Morocco sees a key role in market mechanism. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement allows upscaling the mechanism to a level where emission credits are generated potentially even by policy instrument. Morocco also views opportunity of market mechanism via various pilot initiatives, and the focus sectors of Morocco market mechanism activities are electricity generation, cement, and phosphate production. The mechanism under Article 6.2 should accommodate linkage between emission trading and baseline and credit system. The national CDM pipeline can be converted into activities under Article 6.4. The private sector can benefit both from Article 6.2 and 6.4. The mechanism under Article 6.8 can be used to channel climate finance from north to the south. On this slide, you can see an overview of Morocco's vision of the carbon market approach to support NDC implementation. In order to continue our successful engagement in the CDM and our pioneer role in advancing the Paris market mechanism, we are working with PMR to develop a state-of-the-art methodology of MRV and sectorial effort. The future of the carbon market in Morocco is derived from our ambitious NDC, and we have a strong emphasis on measuring, reporting, and verification. It's a very important issue. And we are providing significant support for capacity building via the 4C Morocco. And also, this represents an integrated view on market mechanism implementation in Morocco. This is just an idea about the 4C, is the platform that we have 4 actors. We have public actors, we have NGO, we have private sector, and also we have research institute. I am not going. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohamed, for this view on how a government, in this case the Moroccan government, sees the positioning of market mechanism in the new Paris Agreement from a national point of view. So now we've, from the beginning where we had a bit of a new look at what a CDM/upscaled mechanism could look like, and the new look at that via now to the Moroccan government, how they see the position of market mechanism. We move now to a presentation by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Philippe Fonta, on sectoral mechanisms with another case study or example from a sector, also important next to the energy sector. We heard already the cement sector. Philippe, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, apologies for arriving late. I spent 20 years of my career playing rugby, but I was most the guys blocking the scrum than the one running fast. Sorry about that. I just would like to illustrate what we have done in the past and in the context of the Kyoto Protocol, and what we have tried to do with the cement sector in terms of sectoral approach to flexible mechanisms, because we have worked a lot on that. But as a starter, you know, we are in a sector which is a very industrial sector, so we are very pragmatic when we want to do things. So the first thing we ask ourselves when we wanted to do the sectoral approach and when we created the Cement Sustainability Initiative, and I tried to adjust it with the words that we are having today in the Paris Agreement, is what do we want to do? What is the ultimate goal? And why do we need market flexible mechanisms? And I will do a kind of back and forth between what we did and adjusted with the current words, so I hope I will not lose you. the Paris Agreement says that we need to limit or to hold the increase in the average temperature to well below 2 degrees and try to achieve the 1.5 degree. Everybody knows that. And on that purpose, the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions is essential. You know that the cement sector, the most, let's say, emitted thing is CO2 for two reasons. One is because of the process itself. When you transform limestone into lime, the calcination process, the chemical reaction, produces CO2. And in addition to that, you made that at a temperature of 1,450 degrees, so you need a lot of fuels to run the kiln. So it also emits CO2. So it's CO2 which is the most greenhouse gas emitted in the process of making cement. So for CO2 with a residence time which is more than 100 years, no matter where it is emitted, what is important is the maximum you can reduce wherever it is. And for that, what we want to do is really to maximize the reduction of greenhouse gas. So for us, maximize the reduction of CO2 emissions from the process, and at the same time minimize the implementation costs, while fostering sustainable development, because the different countries where we operate, where my members operate, don't have the same, let's say, expectations in terms of sustainable development. So that's why what we try to do is that there is not a one-size-fits-all. We try to develop different approaches of sectoral market mechanisms and sectoral approaches when we did that, and I will come back to that. But if we want really to use market mechanisms and have something flexible, first of all, you have to have a market. So you have to set up the conditions for a market for greenhouse gas emissions. And to set up the conditions, you have one way or another to have a price on carbon. Because if you don't have any price, you don't have any incentive to find lower prices elsewhere to reduce the same quantity of CO2 or to reduce even higher quantities of CO2. If you have a price, whatever it is, when it is set, every company will try to see how can I reduce my CO2 in a way which is less costly than the price I have. So if I can get credits in other countries which can compensate for that price, I will do it. And then that will create a market for flexible mechanisms. So then you have mechanisms. And for these mechanisms, you have obviously to have the measurement, reporting, and verification of that. And you have to add additionality, because if you were not implementing these models, or if you were doing these models in the absence of any mechanisms, there is no reason why you should get any credit, because you would have done it in any case. And then you have somehow to be flexible, because at the same time as you have this additionality, it should not be a kind of gas turbine that you create that makes it impossible to make the project. And I must admit that in the previous system, in some cases we came to a situation where, well, we could see now that there was a real additionality that was not agreed by the authorities. It's simply because as it was not agreed, the project simply did not happen. So it means that it was clearly an additionality, because it did not happen in the absence of the incentive. And then it has to be a little bit flexible, as I said. So why did we try to develop a sectoral approach, and what is it? From our point of view, is a combination of policies and measures developed to enhance efficient sector-by-sector greenhouse gas mitigation, addressing data, policy, technology, and capacity building within a sector. All that has to be included in the sectoral approach. The international cooperation with major sector actors to develop and share the knowledge. There will be appropriate sectoral tools. These tools will not be the same from sector to sector, because we don't have the same characteristics. The systems, the data, the best practices will have to be shared. The UNFCCC crediting policies have to be properly understood. There will have to be benchmarking, and this additionality will have to be looked at, and also technology development. And there will have nationally appropriate actions, what we used to call NAMAs and what can be called NDCs, to enable to have emission goals and policies that could be different from countries, because NDCs are different from countries. And how can we help these countries meet and match their NDCs with different development needs. So what we saw as a potential benefit when developing a sectoral approach is that we group a certain number of companies together, and then we get a kind of larger scale, but also greater speed. You can implement things at a greater speed, as I said, a larger scale. There is a faster technology development and deployment, particularly in some technologies that are still emerging and for which we think we will need it in any case, like CCS, for instance. More capacity building to really establish effective systems and measures, and also best policy design to enable sector-tailored tools to manage the competitive impacts associated to these results, because when you speak about the sector, you bring also competitors around the same table, and you have to take a lot of precaution on that. So with regard to the sectoral approach that the cement developed, we developed it in 2009, and we presented it in Copenhagen. The basis for that is that the CSI, the Cement Sustainability Initiative, under the auspices of the WBCSD, was created as early as 1999. So it's a very long project which is still running and that we keep running, and it's a CEO-led organization. We're going to have the annual meeting of the CEOs on the 24th of November, and each and every year, we currently have 24 members, but each and every year we have 16 or 17 CEOs showing up on the same day and validating what we have done in the year and approving for the following year budget. So that's a very robust project. And what we thought could be the baseline for developing a sectoral approach is that we have the most comprehensive database of CO2 and energy data, which is called the Getting the Numbers Right database. If you go onto our website, you can have a view on this database. And this database is independently verified data. So it's perfectly in line with what the Paris Agreement requires in terms of the way to measure the data. It's run by an independent third party to avoid any antitrust problems of competitors sharing information. We don't see the information. Each and every company sees its own information and the aggregated information of the sector, but they don't see the information of their competitors. And that database could serve as a baseline for then demonstrating any additionality or something like that. So we developed the model in 2009 with this international cooperation, with involvement of several stakeholders. The model was developed by ERM, the well-known consultant. PwC was also involved because they are the ones who manage the Getting the Numbers Right database. And the model we developed was peer-reviewed by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratories, by the IEA in France, International Energy Agency, and by also the Research Institute of Innovative Technology for the Earth in Japan. All that was validated by this institute, and this is published. You can still download it on our website. Then we worked to that with the UNFCCC in order to develop something which could be comparable with existing and future mechanisms, what was the ETS, the CDM, the joint implementation as well. We included key developed and developing economies. We tried to use simple metrics to develop that and to have standardized methodology, and we think that is a key for success. And to use a verified emission to track compliance, but also to enhance new technology development, especially CCS. That's what we did. This is a model as we have. And I say that basically most models are false, but some are more useless than others. Or someone I think was useful. So we tried to develop it and to demonstrate some results. And the results that we had identified, well, first of all, we tried to have several scenarios because, as I said, there is no one-size-fits-all, and we didn't know at that time what type of information would be implemented. So we tried to develop a Europe cap and trade only, with cap and trade on Annex 1, with global goals, with sectoral approaches in some countries or in others, some of them being with commitments, others with no commitments. Some on absolute CO2 reductions, others on energy intensity reductions, And we also try to have a global caps everywhere. So we played this scenario and we try to identify what could be the best achievable and what could be the best results that we can get in terms of CO2 reduction. And what we came up with, what we did is we obviously evaluated the cement production evolution over these years. And what we identified is that at the horizon of 2030, clearly the issues which were really making a difference were global caps, global goals, and sectoral approaches. These ones, if you can see on the graphs, the ones which are red, orange, and purple are really the ones who make the difference compared to business as usual. So we see really a benefit of having sectors who want to work together, who have the experience in doing so, working together and developing this sectoral approach. So the conclusions of the model studies, sectoral approach shows a real impact potential for 2020 onwards. There is a greater worldwide CO2 abatement possible under the scenarios, and that was at that time which include Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries. So today there is no longer this differentiation. So there is also a possibility to have not only a north-south, but a south-south cooperation. Cement sector specific technology, and we need CCS for that, but we are not the only sector. Abatement potential varies in region. There is, of course, a risk of leakage, but we can manage that if we design properly the solutions. And to conclude, the sectoral approach at that time was not accepted. Despite all our efforts, it was not accepted. But 2009 was another period, and huge progress have been made since then. There is a multi-sectoral cooperation which is much bigger than previously, with a facilitative dialogue with the Marrakesh partnerships. The Paris Agreement is also a permanent regime, so it's not for a period in which we don't know what you do with the credits after that period. It's a continuous process. It involves all the countries where we can have more opportunities. Then one thing that made it less relevant is that the EU ETS said at a certain point in time the credits cannot be used anymore. So then the value of the credits from the CDM were down to zero, more or less. And the third thing was the bureaucracy. The executive board of CDM was very complex to manage with. That was a very heavy process. The GNR database was not recognized as a baseline, so we cannot use it. But measurement, reporting, and verification is key, so we have to find this, and we see a huge opportunity for transfer of technology and knowledge, and an open cooperation between parties and non-party stakeholders. So that's the experience we had. Unfortunately, it didn't work in 2009, but we really hope that we can now, with the new Paris Agreement, try to reinvigorate this approach and try to see if we can have a sector like the cement work together. And we encourage all the sectors to look at that collectively as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for this refresher on sectoral mechanisms, on this long-term work you're doing with the World Business Council on the cement sector. Unless there is any urgent need for a clarification or so, not discussion on contents or so, but if somebody hasn't understood something or a term or so, we could do that now. Otherwise, we really indeed intend to have at least 20 minutes discussion involving you, the audience. So we'll move to the second brief part on views from panelists. And we have invited three panelists to share views from a different perspective. We have, for one, Xuedu from the Asian Development Bank, who will share views from a financial institution with a bit an Asian angle or perspective. We have, I'll try my best, Ambachew Fekadeneh from Ethiopia, who will look a little bit on it from an African and project developer perspective, and we allow again Philippe for a few minutes to for the business sector, investment community, to private sector to share a few thoughts on what we've seen and heard so far. So we would like to start with, and I would like to ask for 5 minutes, not more, that we later on have the opportunity also to involve the audience to ask questions. So I would like to start with Xuedu from ADB. Please, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Robert, for this opportunity. Yeah, I will be very brief. From the previous 3 presentations, and also from the experience of the carbon market development from the Kyoto Protocol. Actually, personally, I was engaged in the CDM, the negotiation design, serving as the board or alternate member for about 10 years. And sorry that if there's something wrong, that I feel some guilty for those. But anyhow, I just want to maybe share some the view on the carbon market, or either success or failure. I think if I may, I think 3 points we can say that say support the success of the carbon market for under the Kyoto Protocol. If we say some of part of the success, number 1 is the institutional setting. You can see that we, from the UN system, from the national system, even at a company, that for those that have done a lot this carbon market or get benefit or get a good experience, you can see that they have good institutional setting. I guess I don't need to say detail in this, but you can imagine that there's a good institutional setting is very important for the carbon market development. Number 2 is related to the policy. Stable policy, in particular, is very important for carbon market development. Without stable policy, you cannot, one cannot ensure that you will have the market development. And number 3 is related to capacity building. I think this is quite a wider, but actually it is very, very specific. This capacity building related to the government official, if they have the knowledge, the whole society, for in particular those managers who have been engaged in this process, if they know climate change, if they know this additionality, they know those rules, requirements, all this. I think such kind of a capacity building is quite important. Now, I think this is good. I just summarize these 3 key points. Of course, one can maybe you can name more, but I think these 3 are quite important. Then from that experience, then I think this will be also good reference for us to design this new these modalities and procedures for this new Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, how this can work. I think similar to those, these 3 points still also very important. But I believe, my observation, that this new carbon market cooperation under the Paris Agreement will be totally different from the previous one because of those legal bases are quite different. Under Kyoto Protocol, developed countries have commitment, but developed countries don't have. Under the Paris Agreement, all countries, no matter you call it as kind of contribution or commitment, they have their own target. So this is the base, this is the political or legal basis for the cooperation. If we ignore this, I think it will be difficult to talk about how to cooperate for the carbon market under the Article 6. So based on this, I think also several things, these 3 things are quite important. One is also the institutional, and then so policy, and then also the capacity. I can elaborate a little. For institutional, I think all countries, I think we will rely on individual countries to establish their own national institutions to manage their national carbon market. They will be the basis or basic unit for international cooperation. So, and then I think this is quite important. I'm not going to elaborate further, but I think I just highlighted this is very important for national institutions to manage their own. Number 2, this policy, I even want to maybe upgrade as political. Political viewness sorry, 1 minute. This policy or political among countries that to cooperate for carbon market is we consider it's kind of a high priority, or not even number one priority. Without this political willingness between countries, it will not be feasible to do any this carbon market cooperation among countries. And number three is the capacity. That is capacity related to these comparable efforts to under this Paris Agreement. I think this is very, very important. But I believe if you really very need great efforts to elaborate these comparable efforts of all countries. Without these comparable efforts, then it will be very difficult to consider how to trade between countries. And then related to this their technical guidance or their comparable policies. So all these are quite important. Just this will be under the capacity building. So for Asian Development Bank, we consider this actually quite earlier. We initially started from year 2012. Later on, last year, we published our knowledge. We call it emission trading linking the opportunities and challenges in Asia and the Pacific. You can find this report from website. It's a free charge for download. So we consider that this for future cooperation between countries, it will be through this emission trading linking. Of course, I believe that just now you mentioned this sector approach. This could be the maybe first step, but the final the cooperation is the kind of national emission trading linking. But this will really take a long time. So we support countries to do this. And now in East Asia, China, Japan, and Korea, South Korea, they are initiate this technical consultation already, and then we will be happy to support countries in doing this kind of consultation. So with this, sorry that maybe I use 2 or 3 more minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Xuedu. I would like now to invite the Ambachew from Ethiopia to share your views on with an African and project development perspective, please, and also try to stick to the 5 minutes that we can then also invite the audience. Thank you.
Try to go to 4 minutes so that I can compensate. Thank you so much. So I will restrict my interventions on the question for why and how Africa lagged behind in the previous mechanism, and then if time allows, go to the other points. I cannot be able. If I can, I will try to be very brief. The first point is about scarcity of information in the beginning years of the previous mechanism, where you can be able to access the information leading to your full participation. That was the main issue that killed a great toll in the first few years of the years of the previous mechanism. And then comes the tendency to consider the markets for an affair of the business only, and states focusing on the adaptation story only. This has also had a long years of time before governments started to understand and be happy with the fact that tradable units can contribute to success of their mitigation. And then comes the story about when you go to the specific constituency, a story about whether a commodity with no physical dimension can be tradable. Is also an important aspect that had to be broken so that actors can come in and there is a new commodity called this and this that can be tradable. This was very important in terms of determination. And then comes the tendency to automatically constrict the eligible sectors to forests only, whereby individuals were only thinking that they were able to easily implement forest activities in their neighborhoods. But this was not true, because forestry activities itself requires scale, scale requires land, land requires many things, and then also there was methodological issues associated with permanence and other methodological aspects. This was also this also took a long tenure for states to realize that they could expand to other sectors to look for mitigation potentials. There were also various myths that we call myths, that there were no emissions to reduce from African states, which is proven to be wrong, because we see now in NDCs that there's a lot of emissions in their base years back in 2005, 2010, which essentially means there was opportunity to reduce. And then comes the issues associated with methodologies, procedures, processes, and other things that were also great hurdles in the implementation. We previously heard from the WBCSD person that they had challenge with passing through a standard, which is a futuristic standard in the past year, which is really a taboo. Nowadays, we consider sectoral approaches are going to solve issues associated with inconsistent interpretation of baselines, additionalities, project by project. So this was the bulletproof that we were anticipating. The current status, everybody's aware that there are tradable units to come from mitigation. States have put forward NDCs. We have seen the Moroccan NDC, for instance. I come from Ethiopia. I know Ethiopian NDC is one of the most ambitious NDCs. Also, although it comes from an LDC state and has its own respective capability element in it, it is the most ambitious, one of the most ambitious NDCs I know. Many African states have mentioned markets would contribute to the fulfillment of the mitigation activities. So this is also a great signal for the future. There is also growing and glowing expert base back home that has evolved from the experience in the past many years, which can be capitalized on. I agree with Xuedu's recommendation that national institutional arrangements play in terms of trying to allow all of this expert base to form the basis of the domestic institutional capacity. And Africa has now become a better place for investment than before. And we have the Africa Rising story that we all hear. What do we anticipate from the new regime? From the new regime, we agree that this very idea that all states have something to do according to their respective capability makes a very appealing place for the market. Africa, including other LDC states, are negotiating for a respectively accommodating rules environment, which can enable them to implement to achieve their NDC. We anticipate all aspirations, markets and non-market commodities, as also presented by the previous speaker, to be covered either in 6.2, 6.4, or 6.8, where they have a place where they can be considered. Sectoral tools are anticipated by many to tackle this, as I said, in the inconsistency debate and the timeline that takes to establish a project by project baseline, project by project additionality, project by project monitoring thing. I personally am aware of the WBCSD GNR database, and I know that we also had a very big issue associated with how to validate a project through today's thinking, and we needed a tool, a standard mechanism, or some approach, sectoral approach, that would be as easy to pick numbers from and then validate your baseline and additionality. I would finish with this. I'm sure I'm not above 4 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. Okay, well, also, again, a slight change in the agenda, but of course we would like to give the opportunity for you to ask questions. And also, Mohamed, due to his on the government delegation, said he has other business to take care of. So we decided that we start with, in particular, questions with regarding to what the government of Morocco presented. Start with that, 5-10 minutes. It may also that Mohamed will answer in French because he feels more comfortable, but we have also somebody who will translate that for us. So we would like now to invite you, if there's any particular questions from what you've seen, what Mohamed presented, if there's anything, please, you have the chance now. Yeah. And if you please, who you are and then the question. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Volker Ludwig here from Bonn. And actually, I would like to ask you, you told that the NDC approaches could be also done by the private sector. And I would be very much interested whether you have already rules or guidelines or a measurement how to approach you from the private sector.
Is there any also other questions? Maybe collect one or two other particular for Mohamed for the Moroccan presentation. Anybody else? No? Okay, then. There in the back.
Hi, I'm Tobias Schmidt from ETH Zurich. You mentioned three key sectors. One was renewable energy, one was cement, and the other one was phosphate, I guess. And I was wondering, for renewable energy, what are the policies that you would like to achieve the NDC targets with, and whether you think, because I want to to reflect it a bit against what Bjarne said. What do you think a carbon market would do for renewables?
Anybody else? No? Okay, I think then, Mohamed, whenever you're ready, and if you wish, respond in French, and Matthias over here will help if...
I will try in English.
Great.
Yes. I think that the private sector, it's very important because our NDC, we have three numbers. We have 42 reduction. Our ambition is to reduce CO2 for about 42%. And also to do that, we have to mobilize $50 billion. That means that it's very important that the private sector will be involved in this project. And to do that, we start by capacity building, because right now we have to switch from another economic model, because when we talk about 50 billion, that means that our economy must be transformed. And also the private sector will follow this movement. That's why we in Morocco we create one platform that we have 4 actors. We have public, private, and NGO, and also the research area. And the goal for this platform is to enhance capacity of the 4 actors. But when we talk about the private sector, we have a plan with the private sector, to enhance capacity, or enhance capacity that for this actors, and also they are the program. When we talk about 42 reduction about CO2, 50 billion, but we have also we have about 12 program, in energy, in water, because our NDC is, we have 2 pillars in our NDC. We have mitigation, but also we have adaptation. And we try that all the private sector will be involved by by making a framework of finance, because if we want that the private sector will be involved, we have to have some incentive, you know, and and also to have some technical des actions concrètes au niveau de ça. For the second question about how to renewable energy will be involved in the carbon market. With the PMR, as you see, we have 3 areas. We have cement, we have electricity, but also we have phosphate. And the goal for this program, the program is the World Bank program. The goal is to see how we can establish a model of market in Morocco, and how to bring, because these 3 areas is very important. The cement, phosphate, and electricity in Morocco is like a locomotive for our economy. And this program is dealing to see how we can develop some mechanism, you know, to bring this sector inside the carbon market. And inside this 3 area, we have the energy also that can be inside this logic. Thank you very much. I think that.
Thank you, Mohamed. Unless then there are other or more questions to Mohamed, we would like to thank you for your contributions and participation, and thank you very much. I would like also now to invite you, the audience, to ask questions with respect to the innovative approach that has been presented by ETH Zurich, as well as, of course, what has been presented by Philippe from the World Business Council on sectoral mechanisms. I see already 2 or 3. There was somebody there in the back, and then over there next to the door.
Thank you. Roger Dargaville from Monash University in Australia. A question for Dr. Steffen. As I understand it, you've completely de-risked the product from the point of view of the investors in the renewable energy program, but you've, on the flip side, you'll magnify the risk from the investor point of view. So I'm curious if I've understood that correctly, and if you do magnify the risk from the investor side, the purchaser of the mitigation product, will it become too risky for the investors in that product?
We take the other question as well then.
Hi, I'm Renat Heuberger from South Pole. We are one of the largest CDM developers, so my question is actually quite similar but phrased a little bit differently. It's around pricing. In the time of the CDM, pricing was simple, which was both an advantage and a disadvantage. Advantage in terms of negotiations were quite straightforward, you had a market price. But the disadvantage, of course, was that for some projects there were windfall profits, like HFC. For other projects, the market price was too low and they were never happening. Now, if I got you right, you proposed to turn this upside down and actually say we are insuring the risk, so to say. So now, your advantage of your system is that, of course, you pay to every project essentially exactly compensated exactly for the risk. But the disadvantage is the pricing. How would that work in reality? Because now the negotiations would, of course, be much more complicated because before engaging in a deal, you would actually have to understand the risk profile that you're subscribing to. So how would that pricing of this new instrument work in practice?
Both questions for you, Bjarne, so please.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Very valid points and important questions, I think. To start, and also related. I think it's more or less the same direction. To start with the first part of your question, indeed, what the simulation results showed here is a complete de-risking for a project developer, let's say an equity investor into the project from a project development point of view, for the market risks involved. There's still other risks related to the project, operational risks and so on, that are still with the project developer, but for the market risk, it's completely de-risked. And the risk lies with this, what was in the picture in the middle, the centralized unit. And I think that's, which then also relates to your question, that's what's the major difference compared to the CDM market, where we basically had a relationship between the project and the project developer on the one hand side, and the buyer of the certified emission reduction or the outcome on the other side. Is that here we have something in the middle, and the risk for the higher risk for this instrument that takes the risk out of the renewable energy project lies with this unit. And we imagine this unit to be either bilateral or even better, multilateral institutions that realizes projects across different markets, ideally across different regions, across different technologies, so that there's some portfolio effects that this unit can achieve, and then still sell for a standardized price this emission outcome to the buying party. So the basic idea is really to, and I think that's the second big difference to pricing in the CDM world, or at least in the early years of the CDM world, is that many renewable energy projects, they don't need much of a subsidy to be realized on a average level, but it's really the risk involved and the long-term commitments from investors that these cannot take. And if you have a centralized unit that then uses the proceedings they get from the buyer side at a fixed price, XY dollars per ton, and uses most effectively de-risking a larger number of projects and pooling the risks, and then having some portfolio effects there, that we decouple the risk of the local markets that renewable energy project developers face from the risks that you would have an additional risk even if the certified emission reductions also depends on market price. So this doesn't work without the centralized unit, but we think if you have this, some people call it international carbon asset reserve, there's other names for it, then you could really leverage the power of the financing, so to say, and reduce the abatement cost.
Thanks, Bjarne. Other further questions to the presentations, or also what the panelists said? Yes, in the back, please.
Okay, you already know me. So I wanted to ask Philippe, and because you mentioned the sectoral approach as being extremely relevant, and I think what Bjarne presented is a sectoral approach for energy, for electricities particularly. So I was wondering what you in cement see as the key investment hurdle for low carbon cement. Because Bjarne has portrayed that in electricity, it's really the risk. It's really the uncertainty about prices and how markets develop on the output product. So I was wondering to which extent this also applies to cement, and whether a similar approach could also be taken for cement, or whether you say, hey, it's a very different sector, works very differently from an investor perspective, therefore that doesn't make sense for this sector.
Philippe, please. Yep.
Okay. Well, there are several different risks in the cement sector. One of them can be when you need to change your unit of production. It's a return on investment, which is long return on investment, which can be a risk. Let me give you an example. You know that the market is currently under a lot of consolidation in the cement sector, and companies are merging with others, buying others, etc. when this happens, you may end up having in your portfolio a plant which is not that efficient, which is the old technology of wet kilns, for instance, which are not very efficient. Well, basically, you have two ways of doing it if you want to really reduce your CO2 emissions. One is to transform the wet kiln into a dry kiln, and you have to change your complete unit of production. That's huge investment over a long-term horizon. Or simply you close the plant, and then you don't produce any more CO2 emissions. And I'm not cynical, but that may happen. If you close the plant, of course, in your company's account, you reduce your CO2 emissions with limited amount of money. I'm not sure it solves the problem of CO2 because the market of cement will still be there in that region. So you will have to import cement, or you will have to transport clinker and grind the clinker to make the cement. So in the end, you may actually add more CO2 emissions in the atmosphere rather than having the plant itself. The second one is you change your unit of production. That's a huge investment. But if in this huge investment that you consider at the corporate level of the company, because of the huge savings you're going to make in terms of CO2 emissions, you can also get credits that would in a total CO2 reduction, compensate for having fewer investment in other parts of the world, also for fewer reductions, but globally, you have a global reduction which makes sense. That's the benefit of having a flexible mechanism by which you could really make a difference in a country and get credits that makes it viable in terms of financial involvement. So that's the type of things that we see. And one of the main risks I see is this return on investment when you need to do a huge production unit shift.
Thanks, Philippe. Other questions from the audience? Yes, please, here in the front.
I just would like to know, have you other approaches than cement industry?
Do you mean, are there any other sectors doing the same, or is it...
Your council. You have done this cement approach.
Yeah.
Any other branch which you did another approach?
Well, for as far as I'm aware, no, not in the WBCSD at least. One of the reasons being that I'm not saying that my sector is the best compared to the others. I'm just saying that we are the oldest one. So we started in '99, and one thing that has to be added to the need for having, let's say, a stable policy framework, the need for having all the countries, and not only some countries participating in the agreement. Another the things that needs to be brought into the perspective is the trust you need to build within a sector, and from that sector to the other stakeholders, and that takes time. And getting the database that we have today in terms of CO2, which can serve as a baseline, for instance, I can tell you that some of my members who today are the strongest advocate of this database, when we initiated that, they didn't want the database because they said, there is no way I want to share my data with my competitor. But that was not the point. The point was to share the data with the rest of the world, not with the competitor, because we protected that. So this trust takes a lot of time. So for the time being, I didn't see any other sector from our WBCSD having this same approach.
Thanks, Philippe. I understand, Matthias, you have a question. Anybody else? Matthias, please.
Yeah, name's Matthias Honegger. I'm with Perspectives. I think we have seen a very broad range of issues covered on this panel, including innovative approaches which are not discussed in negotiations, but also spanning all the way to the past experiences under the CDM, the need to have strong institutions or clarify the roles of institutions. And especially, I think what was a recurring theme was we need to have capacity building so that the private sector and sometimes also the public sector can actually participate in the emerging markets under the Paris Agreement. My question is, from your diverse perspectives experienced in the UN side of things, in the executive board of the CDM, but also in negotiations and in the private sector, what would be a good way to approach capacity building? For instance, also being aware of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building and its work, how can that be facilitated? Thank you. Whoever feels they want to answer it.
Who wants to?
Just
Yes,
a few
please.
points here. This is a very important question. I consider capacity building has to be target specific. In the past, it was a multilateral financed capacity building towards entities called DNAs, which are state representatives to this market. But in a new sense, the capacity building has to address all actors, non-state actors, state actors, and everyone, and should focus on delivering the product itself. And in that way, we can make the capacity building investment itself efficient and also can see results in a shorter period of time. Thank you.
Xuedu, please.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just share some key points on this. From my point of view, that the future form of carbon market should be at the national level, not those specific project level, because actually all countries have its own either contribution or commitment under the Paris Agreement. Then a country, I think, should establish its own carbon market, no matter in what way. Then, if this would be the case, then several key issues. One is those legal basis to have this carbon market. Actually, if we want to, those carbon unit can be traded, this must be legally defined, because that carbon unit will have value. How those carbon unit can have value? I think they should have legal basis to define that. So this is fundamentally important. I guess this actually most of countries have not yet such kind of legal framework to define this. Then, based on that, a series of policies that should be established, and then national this institution capacity should be built. And then I think this is also very important. In particular, those I guess another issue related to the data. I guess just Philippe also mentioned this data, how to ensure the data accuracy through this policy, through those national system, to ensure all those data, emission data, all these the carbon credit data are accurate. Is fundamentally important for carbon market. Without accurate, the credible data, carbon market will fall down. So I think this legal basis, this data information, accurate data information, clear policy, I think this capacity building, this for capacity, for in particular for different countries, is fundamentally important. Yeah.
Thank you. We have one, and that will probably be the final question or intervention. And looking at the time, yep, please.
Okay, my name is Dane Ratliff from the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. Had a question about, somebody mentioned DNAs, and in the CDM world, DNAs would issue letters of approval, and those would include a statement that the project was going to contribute to sustainable development. What do you see as the analog of that in a future carbon market, and how is a declaration of sustainability going to be checked out, because it wasn't really thoroughly done, as we all know, in the CDM?
Who wants to take this one? Who mentioned the NDAs? Was it, I think you, Ambachew, please.
Yeah, definitely the text of sustainable development is also included in Article 6.2, 6.4. How this will be addressed or ensured is the element of negotiation, the intensity, whether it's to be looked into from the outside, or is it a national prerogative, is also going to be defined in that context. But voluntary authorization on voluntary participation will definitely be part of it, because it's the basic principles laid in one of the mechanisms. So this would be how much we know now, but we know maybe in May or after May or sometime what the actual contents of the LOAs will be. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we will have to come to an end. We learned a few new, some old insights into market mechanisms, what's to come under the Paris Agreement. We had some three interesting interventions, key presentations from ETH Zurich, from the Moroccan government, and from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Also, many thanks to our guests from ADB, from Ethiopia, to share their views on what has been presented and their thoughts and recommendations and questions in this context. And also, I think we had an interesting discussion with a couple of questions around de-risking, what has been presented by ETH Zurich, private sector, how we bring the private sector in, carbon markets, renewables. Are there other sectors? How can we bring them in apart from energy and cement? The capacity building came up. Also interesting that the CDM project developers, I think Renard from Southpol has left, but of course interesting questions for them about are there new mechanisms to solve the pricing issue and how this de-risking can work. And with that, I would like to thank you for being with us today, and yeah, wish you all a continued and interesting conference and interesting side events. Thanks a lot.